What would you do if the person who raised you, who taught you about right and wrong, who you trusted more than anyone else in the world, stole your future right from under your nose? What if that same person looked you in the eye and said, "Family helps family," while federal agents knocked on your door? This is the story of how I learned that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and how a mother's greed turned a family tragedy into a federal crime.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of my Denver apartment at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March. I was deep into studying for my CPA exam, surrounded by financial statements and tax code manuals, when the text message appeared on my screen. It was from my younger sister Emma, and it contained just 4 words that would change everything. Dad's life insurance came. I stared at the message for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what this meant. Our father, Robert Chen, had passed away 8 months earlier from a sudden heart attack at the age of 52. He was a systems engineer at a tech company in Portland, Oregon, where our family had lived since I was 12. Dad was one of those methodical, responsible men who planned for everything, including his own death. He'd maintained a substantial life insurance policy through his employer, something he'd mentioned to me during one of our last conversations about my future career plans. "The money will help you and Emma get established," he'd said, sitting in his favorite recliner in our family's modest 2-story home in the suburbs. "College loans, down payments on homes, maybe starting your own accounting firm someday, Marcus. I want you kids to have opportunities I didn't have." Dad had immigrated from Taiwan in his 20s, with nothing but an engineering degree and determination. He'd worked his way up from entry-level positions, always emphasizing the importance of education and financial responsibility. The life insurance policy was his way of ensuring that his children wouldn't struggle the way he had in those early years in America. But now, 8 months later, Emma's text seemed to suggest that the insurance money had finally been processed. I immediately called her. "Marcus, thank God you're awake." Emma's voice was shaky, almost breathless. At 23, she was 3 years younger than me, working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm in Portland, while living in a cramped studio apartment downtown. "What's going on, Em? Your text. What do you mean the insurance came?" "I got a call from someone at Dad's old company today. They said the life insurance benefit was paid out 6 weeks ago. Marcus, they sent it to Mom. All of it." My stomach dropped. Our mother, Linda Chen, had been acting strangely since Dad's death. Initially, we'd attributed it to grief. She'd been married to our father for 28 years, and his sudden passing had devastated her. She'd become withdrawn, secretive, and had started making comments about money that didn't quite make sense. "How much are we talking about, Emma?" $800,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $800,000? That was more money than our entire family had ever talked about having at one time. It was enough to pay off both of our student loans completely, help us buy homes, maybe even start the accounting practice Dad had always encouraged me to consider. But Marcus, there's more. I called Mom after I got off the phone with the insurance people. I asked her about it directly. What did she say? Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she was keeping it, all of it. She said Dad would have wanted her to be taken care of and that we were young and could figure things out on our own. When I tried to argue with her, she got angry and said that family helps family and that meant we should understand her decision. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what my sister was telling me. Our mother had received nearly $1 million that was meant to help secure our futures, and she had decided to keep every penny for herself? This was the same woman who had raised us to believe in fairness, honesty, and looking out for each other.
"Emma, there has to be some mistake. Maybe she's just confused about how insurance policies work, or maybe she's planning to distribute it but wanted to handle some things first." But even as I said the words, I knew they rang hollow. Over the past few months, Mom's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She'd started making expensive purchases, a new luxury SUV, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. When Emma and I had asked about her sudden spending sprees, she'd been evasive, claiming she'd received some kind of settlement from Dad's employer or that she'd been saving money we didn't know about. Now it all made terrible sense. "Marcus, I think we need to look into this legally. Dad always told us he was leaving the insurance money for us kids, remember? He said it multiple times over the years." I did remember. Dad had been very clear about his intentions regarding the life insurance policy. He'd even mentioned it to several family friends and relatives at various gatherings. He'd wanted to ensure that Emma and I would have financial security after he was gone, especially since he knew that his sudden death would leave us without his income and support during our early career years. But there was a problem. I realized with growing dread that I had no idea what the actual policy documents said. Dad had always talked about his intentions that had he actually designated Emma and me as beneficiaries on the official paperwork? Or had he simply assumed that Mom would do the right thing and share the money according to his wishes? Do you know if we're listed as beneficiaries on the policy itself? That's what I've been trying to figure out. I called the insurance company directly, but they said they could only discuss policy details with the listed beneficiary, which is apparently Mom. They wouldn't tell me anything else. This was becoming more complicated by the minute. If Mom was the sole listed beneficiary, then legally the money was hers to do with as she pleased, regardless of Dad's stated intentions or moral obligations to her children. I think I need to drive up to Portland this weekend and talk to her face to face, I said. This is too important to handle over the phone. I already tried that, Marcus. I went to the house yesterday after work. She wouldn't even let me inside. She said she was tired of us harassing her about money and that we needed to respect her decisions as the surviving spouse. The image of my mother turning away her own daughter at the front door of our childhood home was almost incomprehensible. This was the woman who had baked cookies for our school fundraisers, who had attended every parent-teacher conference and school play, who had taught us that family was the most important thing in the world. There's something else, Marcus. When I was leaving yesterday, I saw her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She pulled me aside and said Mom had been asking strange questions about moving money between banks and whether there were ways to transfer large amounts without it being noticed. Mrs. Patterson used to work at a bank, so Mom was probably trying to get financial advice without going through official channels. A chill ran down my spine. Why would our mother be concerned about hiding money transfers unless she knew she was doing something wrong? The pieces were starting to form a picture that I didn't want to believe. Emma, I think we need to document everything. Every conversation, every interaction with Mom about this money. And we need to find out what Dad's actual policy documents say. How do we do that if the insurance company won't talk to us? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. This isn't just about the money, Em. This is about what Dad wanted for us, and it's about holding Mom accountable for doing the right thing. As I hung up the phone that night, I stared out the window of my apartment at the Denver skyline, trying to make sense of how my world had shifted so dramatically in the span of one phone call. My mother, the woman who had taught me about integrity and family loyalty, had apparently decided that those lessons didn't apply to her when hundreds of thousands of dollars were at stake. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I couldn't have imagined that within a few months, federal investigators would be sitting in that same Denver apartment asking me questions about money laundering and fraud. I couldn't have predicted that the phrase family helps family would become evidence in a criminal case, or that I would have to choose between protecting my mother and seeking justice for my father's memory. All I knew that night was that something was very, very wrong, and that the mother I thought I knew might be someone else entirely.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The drive from Denver to Portland took me 14 hours, and I made it in one shot, fueled by coffee, determination, and a growing sense of dread. I'd called in sick to my accounting internship, something I'd never done before, but this situation demanded immediate action. Emma had agreed to meet me at a coffee shop 3 blocks from our childhood home before I confronted Mom directly. When I walked into the small cafe on Friday afternoon, I barely recognized my sister. Emma had always been the optimistic one in our family, the artist who saw beauty in everything, who could make anyone laugh, even during the darkest times. But the woman sitting at the corner table looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually vibrant personality seemed dimmed. "Marcus, I'm so glad you're here," she said, standing to hug me. "Things have gotten worse since we talked." We sat down, and Emma pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been handled extensively. "I've been doing some digging on my own. Remember how you said we needed to document everything?
Well, I started with Dad's old papers in the garage. She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Look at this. The first document was a photocopy of Dad's employment benefits package from 3 years ago. My eyes immediately went to the life insurance section, where Dad had handwritten notes in the margins. In his careful, precise handwriting, he'd written, "For Marcus and Emma's future, college loans, home down payments, business startup funds." He was planning this, Marcus. Look at the date on these notes. This was right after you started your accounting program. He was thinking about your career, about both of our futures. The second document was even more revealing. It was a letter Dad had written to his benefits administrator requesting information about changing his beneficiary designations. The letter was dated just 6 months before his death. Emma, this is incredible. Do you know if he actually made the changes? That's the problem. I can't find any follow-up paperwork. It's like he started the process but never finished it. She pulled out another document, a bank statement from an account I didn't recognize. And there's this. I found it tucked inside one of Dad's old engineering textbooks. Look at the account name. The statement was for a savings account titled Chen Children's Future Fund. The balance showed $47,000, and the last deposit had been made 2 weeks before Dad's death. My hands were shaking as I held the statement. Em, this account, do you think Mom knows about it? I called the bank yesterday. The account was frozen when Dad died because Mom is listed as the co-owner, but she hasn't accessed it. Marcus, I don't think she even knows this money exists. This changed everything. Not only had Dad been planning to designate Emma and me as life insurance beneficiaries, but he'd also been secretly saving additional money specifically for our futures. The evidence was mounting that our father had very clear intentions about providing for his children after his death. We need to confront Mom with this evidence, I said. Maybe when she sees Dad's actual plans, she'll realize she's going against his wishes. Emma's expression darkened. Marcus, there's something else, something that happened yesterday that made me realize this isn't just about misunderstanding Dad's intentions. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, even though the coffee shop was nearly empty. I drove by the house yesterday evening, just to see if Mom was home. Her new SUV was in the driveway, but there was another car there too, a silver BMW I didn't recognize. Maybe she had a friend over? That's what I thought, so I didn't want to interrupt. But as I was driving away, I saw the person leaving. It was Jake Morrison. The name hit me like ice water. Jake Morrison was Dad's younger brother, our uncle, but he was also the family member that Dad had specifically warned us about. Jake had a history of financial problems, get-rich-quick schemes, and borrowing money from family members that he never paid back. Dad had cut off contact with Jake 5 years earlier after Jake had tried to involve Dad in some kind of questionable investment opportunity. Uncle Jake? What would he be doing at Mom's house? I don't know, but I followed him. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper now. He drove straight to a casino about 20 minutes outside the city. Marcus, he was there for hours. I sat in the parking lot until almost midnight, and he was still inside when I finally left. The implications were staggering. If Mom was somehow involved with Jake and his gambling habits, it could explain her sudden secrecy about the insurance money. Maybe she wasn't just keeping the money for herself. Maybe she was being manipulated into sharing it with someone who had a track record of financial irresponsibility. We need to talk to Mom immediately, I said. This has gone way beyond a family disagreement about inheritance. If Jake is involved, this could get much worse very quickly. Emma nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Marcus, what if we're wrong about Mom? What if she's not the victim here? What if she's working with Jake intentionally? It was a question I'd been trying to avoid, but Emma was right to ask it. The evidence was pointing toward a scenario where our mother might be actively participating in something that went against everything Dad had wanted for our family. We decided to go to the house together. The drive through our old neighborhood felt surreal. Everything looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood, but somehow felt completely foreign. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed that Mom's new SUV had temporary license plates. She'd bought it so recently that she hadn't even gotten permanent registration yet. Mom answered the door before we even knocked, almost as if she'd been watching for us. Her appearance shocked me. She'd always been a woman who took pride in her appearance, but she looked haggard and nervous.
Her hair was uncombed, she was wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in during our last video call 2 weeks earlier, and there were dark stains under her arms that suggested she'd been sweating despite the cool Oregon weather. "Marcus, Emma, this is a surprise," she said, but her tone was anything but welcoming. "I thought we'd already discussed the insurance situation." "Mom, we need to talk. Can we come inside?" She hesitated, looking past us toward the street, as if she was checking to see if anyone else was around. "I suppose, but I can't talk long. I have an appointment this afternoon." The inside of our childhood home was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the family photos that had covered the mantelpiece, replaced by expensive-looking decorative items I'd never seen before. The living room furniture had been rearranged, and there were shopping bags from high-end stores scattered around the room. But what really caught my attention were the multiple cell phones charging on the kitchen counter. Mom had always been a one-phone person, but I counted at least 4 different devices plugged into the wall. "Mom, we found some of Dad's old papers," Emma began, opening her manila folder. "We wanted to show you what his actual intentions were regarding the insurance money." Mom's demeanor changed instantly. The nervous energy was replaced by something that looked almost like anger. "I don't need to see any papers. I was married to your father for 28 years. I know what he would have wanted." "But Mom, look at this," I said, holding up the letter about changing beneficiaries. "Dad was actively trying to make sure Emma and I were taken care of. And there's this savings account that he specifically labeled for our futures." Instead of looking at the documents, Mom crossed her arms and turned away from us. "Your father is gone, and I'm the one who has to deal with reality now. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to maintain this house? How much money I need to live on for the next 30 years? "Mom, $800,000 is enough to maintain this house for decades. We're not asking you to give up your security. We just want Dad's wishes to be honored." That's when Mom said something that would haunt me for months afterward. She spun around to face us, and her expression was one I'd never seen before. Cold, calculated, and completely foreign. "Your father's wishes don't matter anymore. I'm the one who's alive, and I'm the one who gets to make decisions about this family's money. If you two can't understand family helps family, then maybe you need to learn to stand on your own." The phrase, "family helps family," the same words she'd used when Emma first confronted her about the insurance money. But now, hearing it in person, I realized she wasn't talking about family helping each other. She was talking about Emma and me helping her by staying quiet and accepting her decision. "Mom, this isn't helping family. This is taking advantage of family," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I think you both need to leave," Mom said, walking toward the front door. "When you're ready to be adults about the situation, you can call me. But I won't be bullied in my own home." As we walked back to my rental car, Emma was crying quietly. "Marcus, she's not the same person. Something has changed her." I agreed, but I was beginning to suspect that maybe we'd never really known our mother at all. Maybe the caring, ethical woman who had raised us was just a facade, and financial pressure had revealed her true character. But as we drove away from the house, I noticed something that would prove to be crucial later on. In the rearview mirror, I saw Mom standing at the window, talking on one of those cell phones, and parked across the street, almost hidden behind a neighbor's large oak tree. Uncle Jake was watching us. The game had changed. This wasn't just about family disagreements or inheritance disputes anymore. Emma and I were dealing with something much more complex and potentially dangerous. And for the first time, I began to understand that we might need help from outside the family to protect Dad's legacy and our own futures. The question was, how far were we willing to go to fight for what was right?
The law office of Patricia Hendricks was nothing like the imposing corporate firms I'd imagined from watching legal dramas. Located in a converted Victorian house in downtown Portland, it felt more like visiting a counselor than consulting with an attorney. But Patricia came highly recommended by one of my accounting professors, and more importantly, she specialized in estate disputes and insurance fraud.
Emma and I sat across from Patricia's desk on Monday morning, 3 days after our confrontation with Mom. The weekend had been spent researching our legal options and trying to piece together a timeline of Dad's intentions versus Mom's actions. Patricia was in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses that she kept adjusting as she reviewed the documents we'd brought. She had the kind of calm, methodical demeanor that reminded me of Dad, someone who approached problems systematically rather than emotionally. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Patricia said, looking up from Dad's handwritten notes. "Your father died 8 months ago, and a substantial life insurance benefit was paid to your mother as the listed beneficiary. However, you have evidence that your father intended for this money to benefit you and your sister, and you suspect that your mother may be misusing the funds." "That's correct," I replied. "But there's more. We think our uncle might be involved, and Mom's behavior has become increasingly secretive and suspicious." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "Before we discuss legal options, I need to explain something important about insurance law. Unless your father actually changed the beneficiary designation on his policy, your mother is legally entitled to the money regardless of his stated intentions or even written notes about his wishes." My heart sank. "So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that. There are several avenues we can explore, but they're complex and will require substantial evidence." Patricia pulled out a legal pad and began writing notes. "First, if we can prove that your mother is not using the money for its intended purpose, particularly if she's been deceived or coerced by someone else, we might be able to argue constructive fraud." "What does that mean exactly?" Emma asked. "Constructive fraud occurs when someone in a position of trust uses that position to benefit themselves at the expense of others, even if they didn't initially commit fraud. In this case, your mother held your father's trust regarding his intentions for the insurance money. If she's deliberately ignoring those intentions, especially under outside influence, that could constitute constructive fraud." This was encouraging, but Patricia's expression remained cautious. "However, proving this will require documentation of several things: evidence of your father's actual intentions, proof that your mother understood those intentions, and demonstration that she's acting contrary to them, possibly under coercion or for illegitimate purposes. We have Dad's notes and the letter about changing beneficiaries, plus the secret savings account he labeled for our futures. That's a good start, but we need more. We need to establish a pattern of your father's intentions, and we need to understand exactly what your mother has done with the money since receiving it." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Tell me more about this uncle you mentioned. Jake Morrison, was it?" Emma described seeing Jake at Mom's house and following him to the casino. As she spoke, Patricia's expression grew more serious. "This changes the complexity significantly. If your uncle has a gambling addiction and has somehow gained access to or influence over the insurance money, we could be looking at criminal fraud rather than just a civil estate dispute." "Criminal fraud?" I repeated. "You mean this could become a police matter?" "Potentially, yes. Insurance fraud is a federal crime, especially when large amounts of money are involved. If your mother and uncle are working together to misappropriate life insurance benefits, or if your uncle has somehow gained unauthorized access to the funds, federal investigators could become involved." The word federal sent a chill through me. What had started as a family disagreement was potentially escalating into something that could result in criminal charges against my own mother. Patricia continued, "But before we consider involving law enforcement, we need to gather more evidence. I'm going to recommend that we hire a private investigator to document your mother's financial activities and her relationship with your uncle." "How much would something like that cost?" Emma asked. As a graphic designer making barely enough to cover her studio apartment rent, the prospect of expensive legal and investigative fees was daunting. "I work with several investigators, and we can structure payment plans. But I want to be clear about something. If we pursue this case and discover evidence of criminal activity, I'll be legally obligated to report it to the appropriate authorities.
Are you both prepared for the possibility that your mother could face criminal charges? But then I thought about Dad, about his careful planning and his clear intentions for our futures. I thought about the secret savings account with our names on it, and the handwritten notes about wanting to help us establish ourselves financially. Most importantly, I thought about the way Mom had looked at us when she said family helps family. Cold, manipulative, and completely unlike the mother who had raised us. We want to know the truth, I finally said, whatever the consequences. Patricia nodded approvingly. Then let's start with the investigation. I'm going to connect you with David Chen, no relation to your family despite the shared surname. He's a former FBI financial crimes investigator who now works private cases. He specializes in insurance fraud and family financial disputes. She made a phone call, and within an hour, David Chen was sitting in Patricia's office with us. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of sharp, analytical demeanor that made me think he missed very little. I've reviewed the basics of your situation with Patricia, David said, and I'm willing to take the case. But I need you to understand that once I start investigating, there's no controlling where the evidence leads. If I discover criminal activity, I still have contacts in federal law enforcement, and I may recommend involving them. What exactly would you be investigating? Emma asked. David pulled out a tablet and began making notes. Several things. First, I'll conduct financial surveillance of your mother, tracking her spending patterns, any large cash withdrawals, unusual banking activity. Second, I'll investigate your Uncle Jake's activities, particularly his gambling habits and any financial connections to your mother. Third, I'll try to establish a timeline of communication between your mother and uncle, especially around the time the insurance money was received. How long would this take? Initial findings within 2 to 3 weeks, comprehensive report within 6 weeks. But here's what I need from both of you immediately. I want you to maintain normal contact with your mother, but document every conversation. Don't accuse her of anything, don't mention the investigation, but try to get her talking about her financial plans and her relationship with Jake. This felt uncomfortable, almost like we were being asked to spy on our own mother. But I realized that if Mom was truly innocent, if there was some explanation for her behavior that we weren't seeing, then the investigation would clear her and help us understand the real situation. There's one more thing, David continued. I want to try accessing your father's email accounts and phone records around the time of his death. Insurance companies maintain detailed communication logs, and if your father was trying to change his beneficiaries, there should be a digital trail. Patricia interjected, That's where having legal representation helps. I can subpoena communication records that you couldn't access on your own. As we left the law office that afternoon, Emma and I sat in my rental car for several minutes without saying anything. The magnitude of what we just set in motion was overwhelming. Within a matter of hours, we had gone from grieving children fighting for their father's wishes to clients in a potential federal fraud investigation. Marcus, are we doing the right thing? Emma asked quietly. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mom. I've been thinking about our conversation on Friday. Maybe we can find a compromise. Can you both come to dinner Wednesday night? I want to discuss dividing some of the insurance money. I showed the message to Emma, whose eyes widened. She's never offered to share any of it before. Why now? That's when it hit me. Em, what if she knows we're investigating? What if someone saw us at Patricia's office? Or what if Jake has been watching us more closely than we realized? Emma's face went pale. You think this is a trap? I think we need to be very careful. And I think we need to tell David about this message immediately. I called David from the parking lot, and his response confirmed my suspicions. Don't respond to the text yet. This sudden change in her position right after you've consulted with legal counsel is suspicious timing. Let me start my investigation immediately. I want financial surveillance in place before you have any further contact with her. How quickly can you start? I'm starting today. And Marcus, I want you and Emma to be extremely cautious. If your mother and uncle are involved in something criminal, they may be more desperate than you realize. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. As I hung up the phone, I realized that our family crisis had evolved into something potentially dangerous. We were no longer just fighting for our inheritance. We were potentially exposing criminal activity that could involve significant prison time for the people involved. The next few weeks would determine whether our mother was a grieving widow who had made poor decisions or a willing participant in frauding her own children out of their father's final gift to them. But as Emma and I drove back toward her apartment, both of us lost in our own thoughts, neither of us could have imagined that within 48 hours, David's investigation would uncover evidence that would change everything we thought we knew about our family, our father's death, and the true scope of the fraud that had been committed against us.
David Chen's first investigative report arrived in my email at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after we'd hired him. I was in my Denver apartment trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy by keeping up with my CPA studies, but my concentration had been shattered since returning from Portland. The subject line read, "Urgent. Initial findings require immediate discussion." I called Emma immediately, waking her up in her Portland studio apartment. "Em, David sent his preliminary report. We need to conference call with him and Patricia right now." Within 20 minutes, we were all on a four-way call that would fundamentally change how I understood not just the current situation, but my entire family history. "I'm going to be direct with you both," David began, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard it. "What I've discovered goes far beyond simple insurance fraud. Your mother and uncle have been operating what appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation for at least 3 months. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone. "Money laundering? What does that mean exactly?" Patricia jumped in. "Money laundering is the process of making illegally obtained money appear legitimate by moving it through various accounts and transactions. It's a federal felony with severe penalties." David continued, "Here's what I've documented so far. Since receiving the insurance payout, your mother has opened 7 different bank accounts across 3 states. She's been systematically moving money between these accounts in amounts just under $10,000, which is the threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting requirements. But why would she need to hide the money? The insurance payout was legal." That's where it gets complicated. The insurance money appears to be mixing with funds from another source, money that I believe is connected to your Uncle Jake's gambling activities. But Marcus, Emma, I don't think Jake is just a gambler. I think he's been running an underground gambling operation, and your mother has become his financial partner. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Our mother wasn't just keeping money that should have belonged to Emma and me. She was using Dad's life insurance payout to help fund criminal activities. "David, how certain are you about this?" Patricia asked. "Very certain. I've documented multiple large cash deposits into your mother's accounts that coincide with major gambling events. Last week, there was a $47,000 cash deposit made the day after an underground poker tournament that Jake organized. The money went into one of your mother's new accounts, then was immediately transferred to 3 different banks." Emma's voice was shaking when she spoke. "So Mom isn't just keeping our inheritance, she's using it for crimes." "It appears that way. But there's more. I've been monitoring communications between your mother and Jake, and I believe they're planning to leave the state. Possibly the country." This was escalating beyond anything I imagined possible. What kind of communications? They've been using encrypted messaging apps and prepaid phones, which explains the multiple devices you saw at your mother's house. Yesterday, I intercepted a conversation where they discussed closing operations and mentioned something about international transfers that needed to be completed by the end of the month. Patricia's voice was sharp with concern. "David, if they're planning to flee with the money, we need to act immediately. Once funds are transferred internationally, especially to certain countries, recovery becomes extremely difficult." I agree, which is why I'm recommending that we involve federal investigators immediately. This is no longer something we can handle through civil litigation. The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. We were about to turn our own mother over to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. But as I processed David's findings, I realized that the woman involved in these activities wasn't really the mother I'd known, or thought I'd known. "What would happen to Mom if she's arrested?" Emma asked quietly.
Patricia answered with professional gentleness. Given the amounts involved and the interstate nature of the activities David has documented, your mother could be facing federal charges for money laundering, insurance fraud, and potentially racketeering if the gambling operation is as extensive as it appears. We're talking about potential prison sentences measured in years, not months. But, David interjected, there's something else you both need to know, something I discovered that changes the entire context of the situation. He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers. I've been investigating the timeline around your father's death, trying to understand when your mother's relationship with Jake began. What I found suggests that this criminal partnership didn't start after your father died, it started before. What do you mean? I asked, though I was beginning to fear the answer. Your father's employer provided me with his email communications from the month before his death. He had been asking questions about life insurance payouts, specifically about how quickly benefits are paid and whether there are ways to expedite the process. More importantly, he'd been researching symptoms of heart attacks and had bookmarked several medical websites about cardiac episodes in healthy men.
Emma's voice was barely a whisper. You think Dad knew something was wrong with his health? I think your father suspected he was in danger. 3 weeks before his death, he sent an email to his benefits administrator asking about the process for changing life insurance beneficiaries and specifically mentioned wanting to protect his children's futures in case something happened to him. The implication was staggering. Had Dad somehow known that Mom and Jake were planning something? Had he been trying to protect Emma and me from financial fraud that was already in motion? There's one more thing, David continued. I accessed your father's medical records through the legal subpoena Patricia obtained. The autopsy report shows that your father died from a heart attack, but there were some unusual circumstances. What kind of unusual circumstances? Patricia asked. Your father had no history of heart disease, no risk factors, and no family history of cardiac problems. The coroner noted that the heart attack was unexplained and that your father was in excellent physical condition. More importantly, toxicology tests showed elevated levels of potassium in his system. I felt like the world was spinning around me. Are you suggesting that Dad's death wasn't natural? I'm suggesting that we need a more thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding your father's death. Elevated potassium levels can occur naturally during cardiac events, but they can also be induced artificially. Given what we now know about your mother and uncle's criminal activities, and given the timing of your father's research into life insurance payouts, I think we need to consider the possibility that your father's death was not accidental. Emma was crying now, and I felt like I might be sick. The possibility that our mother and uncle had murdered our father for insurance money was almost incomprehensible. David, Patricia said, given these findings, I'm legally obligated to report this information to federal authorities immediately. This is no longer a civil matter or even a simple fraud case. We're potentially dealing with murder. I agree. I've already prepared a comprehensive report for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They'll want to interview both Marcus and Emma within the next few days. As the call ended, Emma and I sat in silence for several minutes, each trying to process the magnitude of what we'd learned. In the span of one phone call, our understanding of our family had been completely destroyed. Our mother wasn't just a grieving widow who had made selfish decisions about inheritance money. She was potentially a murderer who had killed our father and was now using his life insurance payout to fund criminal enterprises. But even as I struggled with the emotional impact of these revelations, I realized that Emma and I had to make a critical decision. We could still walk away from this investigation. We could choose to ignore what we'd learned and try to rebuild some kind of relationship with Mom. We could accept that Dad was gone and that the money was lost and try to move forward with our lives. Or we could commit fully to seeking justice for our father, regardless of the personal cost. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Knowing what we know now,
Are you prepared to testify against Mom if it comes to that? She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than I had heard it in weeks. Marcus, if Mom killed Dad, then she's not our mother anymore. She's someone who murdered the man we loved most in the world and then tried to steal the future he wanted to give us. I don't care what DNA we share, that person deserves to be in prison. Even if it means she might spend the rest of her life behind bars? Especially if it means that. Dad deserves justice, and we're the only ones who can get it for him. That afternoon, I made the most difficult phone call of my life. I contacted FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez, the financial crimes investigator that David had recommended. Within hours, she was on a plane to Portland, and Emma and I were officially cooperating witnesses in a federal investigation into murder, money laundering, and insurance fraud. But as I hung up the phone with Agent Martinez, I realized that our commitment to seeking justice would soon put Emma and me in more danger than we had ever imagined. Because if Mom and Jake were capable of murdering our father, what would they do to the children who were about to expose their crimes? The next phase of our investigation would answer that question in ways that would test our courage, our family bonds, and our survival instincts in the most terrifying weeks of our lives.
The FBI field office in Portland was a stark, imposing building that made me feel like a criminal just walking through the metal detectors. Emma and I had been cooperating with Special Agent Sarah Martinez for 10 days, providing detailed statements about our family history, our father's behavior before his death, and every interaction we'd had with Mom and Uncle Jake since the insurance money had been paid out. Agent Martinez was nothing like the FBI agents I'd seen in movies. She was in her early 30s, methodical rather than dramatic, and had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she already knew the answers, but was testing whether you'd tell the truth. Her specialty was financial crimes that crossed state lines, and she'd been working cases involving insurance fraud and money laundering for 8 years. "We're ready to move forward with arrests," she told us during what we thought would be a routine briefing meeting. "We have enough evidence to charge your mother with money laundering, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Your uncle will be charged with operating an illegal gambling enterprise and money laundering." Emma and I looked at each other. After weeks of investigation and mounting evidence, we'd been preparing ourselves for this moment. But Agent Martinez's expression suggested there was more to the story. "However," she continued, "we've encountered a significant problem that changes everything about this case." She opened a thick file folder and pulled out several photographs. "Yesterday morning, our surveillance team discovered that your mother and uncle have disappeared." The first photograph showed Mom's house, but with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. The second showed the interior of the house, completely empty except for a few pieces of furniture that had been left behind. The third photograph was of a bank statement showing that all of Mom's accounts had been closed and the funds transferred to an overseas bank in the Cayman Islands. "They're gone?" I asked, struggling to process what I was seeing. "They left sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning. Our surveillance team was monitoring the house, but your mother and uncle had apparently been planning this exit strategy for weeks. They used a moving company that specializes in international relocations, and by the time our agents realized what was happening, the moving trucks were already gone." Emma slumped forward in her chair. "So they got away with everything?" Agent Martinez's expression grew even more serious. "It's worse than that. Before leaving, they cleaned out not just the insurance money, but also your father's secret savings account, the one you discovered that was labeled for your futures. They somehow gained access to that account and transferred those funds as well." The news hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Mom and Jake escaped with the $800,000 life insurance payout, but they'd also stolen the additional $47,000 that Dad had been secretly saving specifically for Emma and me. Every penny of our father's financial legacy was gone. "How is that possible?" I asked. "How could Mom access an account that had our names on it?" And that's where we discovered another layer of fraud. Your mother had been forging your father's signature on bank documents for months before his death. She'd already added herself as a signatory to the children's savings account by claiming she was acting on your father's behalf to consolidate family finances before his retirement. Agent Martinez pulled out another document.
The bank has security footage of your mother signing papers for account access just 2 weeks before your father died. She was planning this theft long before she had any legal access to the insurance money. Emma was crying now, but they were tears of rage rather than sadness. She was planning to steal from us before Dad even died? It appears so, which brings us to our next problem. Agent Martinez leaned forward, her tone becoming more urgent. Your mother and uncle have left something behind that suggests you both may be in danger. She handed us a printout of an email that had been sent from one of Mom's encrypted accounts to an unknown recipient. The message was brief, but chilling. The kids know too much. They've involved federal agents, need to ensure they can't testify about Robert's death or the financial arrangements. We'll handle remotely. I read the message 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Are you saying Mom is planning to hurt us? I'm saying that your mother and uncle have demonstrated they're willing to commit murder for financial gain. They've successfully fled the country with nearly $1 million, and they've sent communications suggesting that you and Emma are perceived as threats to their security.
Agent Martinez continued, "We're placing both of you in protective custody immediately. Our intelligence suggests that your mother and uncle have hired someone to monitor your activities and potentially harm you to prevent your testimony in any future legal proceedings." The room felt like it was spinning. In the span of a few minutes, I'd learned that Mom and Jake had escaped with all of Dad's money, that Mom had been planning the theft for months before Dad's death, and that Emma and I were now potential targets for assassination. "Protective custody?" Emma asked. "For how long?" "Until we can locate your mother and uncle and neutralize the threat. Unfortunately, that could take months or even years. The Cayman Islands don't have an extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes, and your mother and uncle appear to have enough money to disappear completely." This was the moment when the full scope of our situation became clear. We'd lost our father, lost our inheritance, lost our mother to criminal activity, and now we were losing our freedom and safety as well. Everything we'd worked for, everything Dad had planned for our futures, was gone. But the worst part was yet to come. "There's one more thing," Agent Martinez said, hesitating as if she wasn't sure whether to share the information. "Our investigation into your father's death has reached a dead end." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The elevated potassium levels in your father's system could have been caused by the heart attack itself rather than by external poisoning. The coroner has reviewed the case again and concluded that while the circumstances of your father's death were unusual, there's insufficient evidence to prove murder." Emma looked devastated. "So we'll never know if they killed him? Without your mother and uncle available for questioning and without additional physical evidence, we can't build a murder case. The financial crimes are clear and prosecutable, but the potential homicide will remain an open question." Agent Martinez closed the file folder. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. You've been incredibly brave in coming forward and cooperating with our investigation, but sometimes, even when we know what probably happened, we can't prove it in court." As Emma and I left the FBI office that afternoon, escorted by federal marshals who would be responsible for our safety indefinitely, I realized that our pursuit of justice had cost us everything and delivered almost nothing in return. Mom and Jake were free, living comfortably on stolen money in a tropical paradise. Dad's true cause of death would never be known. Emma and I were effectively in hiding, cut off from our normal lives and uncertain when we'd ever feel safe again. "Marcus," Emma said as we were driven to a safe house location that we weren't allowed to know in advance, "do you think we made the right choice, fighting for Dad's memory and our inheritance?" It was a question I'd been asking myself repeatedly since Agent Martinez had delivered the devastating news. We could have accepted Mom's initial decision to keep the insurance money. We could have grieved our father's death without questioning its circumstances. We could have moved on with our lives, poor but free. Instead, we'd chosen to pursue justice and lost everything in the process. "I don't know, Em," I admitted. "I honestly don't know anymore." But as our unmarked car pulled into the driveway of a nondescript house in a residential neighborhood somewhere outside Portland, I realized that our story was far from over. Mom and Jake might have won this round, but they'd made a critical mistake in threatening Emma and I.
They'd turned a financial crime into a personal war. And while they had money and international hideouts, Emma and I had something they underestimated: federal law enforcement resources, an unshakable determination to honor our father's memory, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The question was whether those advantages would be enough to bring down criminals who had proven they were willing to kill for money and who now had nearly unlimited resources to stay hidden. The safe house would give us time to regroup, plan, and figure out how to turn our devastating setback into the foundation for a comeback that would finally deliver the justice our father deserved. But first, we had to survive whatever Mom and Jake were planning to do to silence us permanently.
The safe house in Beaverton, Oregon was a modest ranch-style home that looked like every other house on the quiet suburban street. Emma and I had been living there for 6 weeks under the protection of U.S. Marshals, trying to build some kind of routine while federal agents continued their investigation into Mom and Uncle Jake's whereabouts. The isolation was suffocating, but it gave us time to think, plan, and most importantly, to go through Dad's personal belongings that the FBI had returned to us. It was on a rainy Thursday morning in November when Emma made the discovery that would change everything. "Marcus, you need to see this immediately," she called from the living room, where she'd been sorting through Dad's old engineering notebooks. Her voice had an urgency that made me drop the tax law textbook I'd been studying and rush to see what she'd found. Emma was holding a small leather journal that I'd never seen before, hidden inside the binding of one of Dad's larger technical manuals. The journal was filled with Dad's handwriting, but unlike his usual neat engineering notes, these entries looked hurried, almost frantic. "Look at the dates," Emma said, pointing to the top of the first page. "These entries start 3 months before Dad died." I took the journal and began reading aloud. March 15th. "Linda has been asking strange questions about my life insurance policy. She wanted to know exact payout amounts and how quickly benefits are processed. When I asked why, she said she was just trying to understand our financial situation better. But she's never shown interest in insurance details before." Emma and I looked at each other with growing excitement. This was evidence that Dad had been documenting suspicious behavior long before his death. I continued reading. March 22nd. "Found Linda on the phone with Jake last night. She hung up quickly when I entered the room and claimed it was about planning a surprise for my birthday. But my birthday isn't until October, and Linda has never liked Jake. Something is wrong." The entries continued chronologically, documenting increasingly alarming observations about Mom's behavior and her secret communications with Uncle Jake. But it was the entry dated just 1 week before Dad's death that made my hands shake as I read it. April 8th. "I think Linda and Jake are planning something terrible. I overheard them talking about accelerating the timeline and making it look natural. Linda has been researching heart attack symptoms online. I found the browser history on her laptop. She's also been asking me about my daily routine, what time I eat breakfast, whether I take any medications. I'm scared of my own wife." Emma gasped. "Marcus, Dad knew they were planning to kill him." But the most important entry was the last one, dated just 2 days before Dad's death. April 11th. "I've changed my life insurance beneficiaries to Marcus and Emma, but I haven't told Linda yet. I've also moved most of our savings to a separate account that only the kids can access. If something happens to me, this journal will be the evidence they need. I've hidden copies in 3 locations that Linda doesn't know about. The truth must come out." 3 locations, I said. "Emma, if Dad hid copies of this journal, there might be more evidence we haven't found yet." I immediately called Agent Martinez, who arrived at the safe house within 2 hours. When she saw the journal, her entire demeanor changed from resigned frustration to renewed determination. "This changes everything," she said, carefully photographing each page. "This is contemporaneous documentation of premeditation. If your father actually changed his beneficiaries before his death, then your mother's collection of the insurance money wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal fraud, even without the money laundering charges." "But how do we prove Dad actually changed the beneficiaries?" Emma asked. "The insurance company said Mom was the listed beneficiary when they paid out." Agent Martinez was already making phone calls.
We're going to re-examine every document in your father's case. If he changed the beneficiaries just days before his death, there should be paperwork somewhere. Insurance companies maintain detailed records of all policy modifications. Within 24 hours, Agent Martinez had discovered something that the original investigation had missed. Dad had indeed submitted paperwork to change his life insurance beneficiaries, designating Emma and I as the primary beneficiaries and removing Mom entirely. However, the insurance company had received a second set of documents just hours after Dad's death, signed with his forged signature, changing the beneficiaries back to Mom.
Your mother submitted fraudulent paperwork to reverse your father's beneficiary changes, Agent Martinez explained during an emergency briefing. She used her access to his personal information and her practice forging his signature to steal the insurance money that legally belonged to you and Emma. But the breakthrough that would prove crucial came when Agent Martinez's team located the other copies of Dad's journal that he'd mentioned hiding. The first copy was found in his desk at work, sealed in an envelope marked, "For my children, open only if something happens to me." The second copy was discovered in a safety deposit box that Dad had opened just weeks before his death, with Emma and me listed as the only authorized access holders. The third copy, however, contained additional information that none of us had expected. "Your father was more thorough than any of us realized," Agent Martinez said, holding the final journal copy. "This version contains photographs." Dad had somehow managed to secretly photograph Mom and Uncle Jake during several of their meetings. The images showed them exchanging envelopes of cash, reviewing what appeared to be financial documents, and, in one particularly damning photo, looking at a bottle of what appeared to be potassium supplements while consulting medical websites on Mom's laptop. These photographs, combined with the journal entries documenting their conversations about accelerating timelines and making it look natural, give us enough evidence to pursue murder charges, Agent Martinez explained. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the back pages of the third journal was a copy of a letter that Dad had written but never sent. It was addressed to the FBI. "My name is Robert Chen, and I believe my wife, Linda Chen, and my brother-in-law, Jake Morrison, are planning to murder me for life insurance money. If you are reading this letter, it means my suspicions were correct, and I am dead. I have documented their planning process and have evidence of their conspiracy. Please protect my children, Marcus and Emma Chen, and ensure they receive the inheritance I intended for them." The letter included detailed descriptions of conversations Dad had overheard, copies of suspicious financial documents he'd found among Mom's belongings, and a complete timeline of their planning process. Most importantly, it included the names and contact information for several witnesses who could testify about Mom and Uncle Jake's gambling debts and their desperate need for money. "Your father essentially built the entire criminal case for us before his death," Agent Martinez said, with something approaching awe in her voice. "He documented everything we needed to prove murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and money laundering." Emma was crying, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than grief. "He was trying to protect us, even while they were planning to kill him." Agent Martinez nodded. "Your father was incredibly brave. He suspected what they were planning, but instead of running or confronting them directly, he stayed to gather evidence that would ensure justice for his murder and financial security for his children." "But Mom and Jake are still in the Cayman Islands," I pointed out. "How does this evidence help us if we can't arrest them?" Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "That's where you're wrong. Murder charges change everything about international law enforcement. The Cayman Islands will extradite suspects for homicide cases, especially when we have this level of evidence. And, more importantly, your mother and uncle made a critical mistake." She pulled out another file folder. "They've been using their real names on financial transactions in the Cayman Islands. They thought they were safe because financial crimes don't usually result in extradition, but they weren't expecting murder charges. Our international task force has been tracking their movements, and we know exactly where they are." "You're going to arrest them?" "We're going to do better than that."
The Cayman Islands authorities are cooperating with our investigation, and they're prepared to freeze all accounts associated with your mother and uncle pending their extradition to the United States. Not only will we be able to prosecute them for your father's murder, but we'll be able to recover every penny of the money they stole. As Agent Martinez left the safe house that evening to coordinate the international arrests, Emma and I sat in the living room holding Dad's journals and feeling something we hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Dad had anticipated everything. He'd documented the conspiracy, gathered evidence of the murder plot, changed his insurance beneficiaries to protect our inheritance, and even hidden the evidence in multiple locations to ensure it would be found after his death. But most importantly, he'd given us something that no amount of money could replace: the knowledge that he'd loved us enough to risk his life, ensuring that justice would eventually be served. The next morning, Agent Martinez called with news that would vindicate everything Emma and I had suffered through. Linda Chen and Jake Morrison were arrested 2 hours ago in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. They're being held pending extradition proceedings. And all accounts containing the stolen funds have been frozen. You're going to get your father's money back, and his killers are going to face justice. The breakthrough had come not from sophisticated FBI investigative techniques, but from a father's love and his determination to protect his children even beyond death.
The federal courthouse in Portland had become as familiar to Emma and me as our own home over the past 8 months. We'd spent countless hours in witness preparation sessions, depositions, and pretrial hearings as the government built their case against Mom and Uncle Jake. But nothing had prepared us for the emotional intensity of sitting in the witness stand, looking directly at our mother as she sat at the defendant's table in orange prison clothing, facing charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and money laundering. The trial had been front-page news in Portland for weeks. Mother accused of murdering husband for insurance money ran in the Oregonian almost daily, with increasingly sensational details about the case emerging during jury selection and opening statements. Emma and I had been staying in a different safe house during the trial, partly for security reasons, but mostly because we couldn't bear to be in the same city where our family's destruction was being displayed as public entertainment. Lead prosecutor Amanda Walsh had warned us that testifying against our own mother would be the most difficult thing we'd ever do. But nothing could have prepared us for the moment when Mom's defense attorney, Richard Blackstone, began his cross-examination of my testimony. "Mr. Chen," Blackstone began, approaching the witness stand with a sympathetic expression that didn't match the aggressive questioning I knew was coming, "you've testified that you believe your mother murdered your father, but isn't it true that you and your sister stood to inherit a substantial amount of money if your mother was convicted of these crimes?" The question was designed to suggest that Emma and I had fabricated the entire case for financial gain. I'd been preparing for this line of attack for months, but hearing it stated so bluntly in front of a jury still felt like a physical blow. "The money was never about us," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was about honoring our father's wishes and ensuring that his killers faced justice." "But Mr. Chen, $800,000 is a significant sum for 2 young people starting their careers. Isn't it possible that your grief over your father's death caused you to misinterpret your mother's actions as something more sinister than they actually were?" Blackstone was skilled at making reasonable-sounding arguments that completely ignored the mountain of evidence against his clients. For the next 2 hours, he systematically tried to undermine every piece of testimony I'd given, suggesting that Dad's journal entries were misunderstood, that the photographs could have innocent explanations, and that Emma and I were motivated by greed rather than justice. The most devastating moment came when he asked me to look directly at my mother and state whether I truly believe she was capable of murder. I turned toward the defendant's table, where Mom sat between her attorney and Uncle Jake. She looked older than I remembered, with gray streaks in her hair and deep lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before Dad's death. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the woman who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework and celebrated every achievement in my life. But then I remembered Dad's journal entries, the photographs of her planning his death, and the forged documents she'd used to steal our inheritance. I remembered the cold, calculating way she'd looked at Emma and me when we'd confronted her about the insurance money, and the threatening email she'd sent about handling us before fleeing the country. Yes, I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. I believe my mother murdered my father for money, and I believe she would have killed Emma and me, if necessary, to protect her crimes. The courtroom was completely silent for several seconds after my testimony. Even Blackstone seemed taken aback by the directness of my answer. In the gallery, I could see several jurors looking between me and Mom with expressions of shock and sympathy. But the ultimate test of our case came when Emma took the witness stand the following day. As the younger sibling and the one who had always been closest to Mom, Emma's testimony would be crucial in convincing the jury that we weren't children who had turned against their mother out of greed or misunderstanding. Emma had been dreading this moment for months. Unlike me, she had never been comfortable with public speaking, and the thought of testifying in front of a packed courtroom while television cameras recorded every word had given her panic attacks during our preparation sessions. But when Prosecutor Walsh began her direct examination, Emma found a strength and clarity that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including me. My mother taught me that family was the most important thing in the world, Emma began, her voice clear and steady. She taught me that we always protect each other, that we always tell the truth, and that we never hurt the people we love for personal gain. The woman sitting at that defendant's table violated every principle she taught me when she murdered my father and stole the money he saved for our futures.
Walsh guided Emma through the timeline of events, focusing on the emotional impact of discovering Mom's betrayal and the evidence of her crimes. But it was during Blackstone's cross-examination that Emma delivered the testimony that would become the turning point of the entire trial. "Miss Chen," Blackstone said, attempting the same sympathetic approach he'd used with me, "you were very close to your mother growing up, weren't you?" "Yes, I was." "And losing your father was traumatic for your entire family." "It was devastating." "Isn't it possible that your mother's behavior after your father's death was the result of grief and poor judgment rather than criminal intent?" Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could see her considering the question carefully. When she finally responded, her answer silenced the entire courtroom. "Mr. Blackstone, my mother didn't just make poor decisions after Dad died. She planned his murder for months while living in the same house with him, eating dinner with him every night, and pretending to love him. She forged legal documents to steal money that Dad specifically intended for my brother and me. She threatened to have us killed when we tried to seek justice for our father. That's not grief or poor judgment, that's evil." The word evil hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several jurors were visibly emotional, and even the judge seemed affected by Emma's testimony. Blackstone tried to continue his cross-examination, but the damage had been done. Emma had articulated what everyone in the courtroom was thinking, but hadn't been willing to say out loud. The final test came during the prosecution's closing arguments, when Walsh played a recording that none of us had heard before. FBI agents had obtained permission to record phone calls between Mom and Uncle Jake while they were in custody in the Cayman Islands, and one conversation in particular demolished any remaining doubt about their guilt. The recording was scratchy and difficult to hear at first, but Mom's voice became clear as the volume was adjusted. "Jake, if those kids hadn't found Robert's journals, we would have gotten away with everything. We should have searched his office more thoroughly before we killed him." Uncle Jake's response was even more damning. "Linda, we can still beat this if we stick to our story. No one can prove exactly how we gave Robert the potassium. As long as we claim it was natural causes, they can't convict us." But it was Mom's final statement on the recording that sealed their fate. "I don't regret killing Robert. He was going to change his will and leave everything to the kids anyway. At least this way, we got 8 months of freedom and almost $1 million before they caught us." The courtroom erupted when the recording ended. Mom's own words had confirmed every aspect of the prosecution's case: premeditated murder, financial motive, and complete lack of remorse for killing the man who had loved and trusted her for 28 years.
As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Emma and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, emotionally exhausted, but relieved that we'd finally told Dad's story in its entirety. We'd honored his memory by ensuring that his killers would face justice, and we'd proven that his love for us had been stronger than their greed and evil. "Marcus," Emma said quietly, "do you think Dad would be proud of what we did?" I thought about Dad's journal entries, his careful planning to protect us even while facing death, and his determination to ensure that the truth would eventually come out. I thought about the courage it had taken for Emma and me to testify against our own mother, and the strength we'd found to seek justice despite overwhelming personal cost. I think Dad knew exactly what we would do when we found his evidence. He trusted us to be brave enough to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing we could possibly imagine. 3 hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. Mom and Uncle Jake would spend the rest of their life in federal prison, and Emma and I would finally receive the inheritance that Dad had died trying to protect for us. But more importantly, we'd proven that love and justice could triumph over greed and evil, even when the stakes were life and death, and the enemies were our own family members.
2 years after the trial ended, I stood in the office of my newly established accounting firm in downtown Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains and thinking about how completely my life had changed. The brass nameplate on my desk read, Marcus Chen, CPA, Chen Financial Justice Services. And the mission statement hanging on my wall captured everything Emma and I had learned from our ordeal. Protecting families from financial fraud and ensuring that victims received the justice they deserve. The insurance money and Dad's secret savings account had been fully recovered and transferred to Emma and me, along with additional compensation from the insurance company for their failure to properly verify the forged beneficiary documents. But more importantly, our case had led to significant changes in how insurance companies handle beneficiary modifications and verify the authenticity of last-minute policy changes. Emma had used her portion of the inheritance to start a nonprofit organization in Portland called the Robert Chen Foundation, which provided legal assistance to families dealing with insurance fraud and financial elder abuse. She'd also returned to school to get a law degree, inspired by our experience with the legal system, and determined to help other families navigate similar crises. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the relationship Emma and I had built with each other. The trauma of losing our father and fighting for justice had forged a bond between us that was unbreakable. We spoke almost daily, visited each other frequently, and had created a new definition of family based on trust, honesty, and mutual support, rather than just shared DNA. The physical reminders of our ordeal were still present in both our lives. Emma had a small scar on her hand from a stress-related accident during the trial, and I still occasionally woke up from nightmares about the months we'd spent in protective custody. But we'd both learned to see these scars as symbols of survival rather than damage. One of the most unexpected outcomes of our case was the impact it had on insurance fraud prevention nationwide. Our story had been featured in congressional hearings about financial crimes against families, and the evidence Dad had gathered had helped FBI investigators solve 3 other similar cases involving family members who had murdered relatives for insurance money. Special Agent Sarah Martinez had become something of a friend over the years since the trial, and she regularly consulted with both Emma and me on other cases involving financial crimes within families. She told us that our willingness to pursue justice despite the personal cost had inspired other victims to come forward in cases they might otherwise have tried to handle privately. Your father's documentation methods have become a model for other investigators, she'd explained during one of our annual check-ins. Law enforcement agencies across the country now train officers to look for similar evidence patterns when investigating suspicious deaths involving recent changes to insurance policies or family financial disputes. But the most profound changes were internal.
Emma and I had both struggled with guilt and anger for months after the trial ended. Guilt over having our own mother sent to prison for life, and anger over the years of childhood memories that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what she was truly capable of. We'd both gone through extensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering that the woman who had raised us was capable of murder. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the family trauma specialist we'd been seeing, had helped us understand that grieving the loss of the mother we thought we knew was just as important as grieving the loss of our father. You didn't lose one parent, Dr. Santos had explained. You lost two. Your father was murdered, and your mother was revealed to be someone completely different than who you believed her to be. Both losses require mourning. The therapy had also helped us understand that our decision to pursue justice hadn't been about revenge or money. It had been about honoring the father who had loved us enough to risk his life documenting the truth. Every difficult moment of the investigation and trial had been a way of saying thank you to Dad for his sacrifice and ensuring that his death had meaning. One of the most healing experiences had been connecting with other children who had lost parents to family violence. Through Emma's foundation, we'd met dozens of people who had survived similar betrayals and found ways to rebuild their lives around new definitions of family and trust. Marcus had told me about meeting a woman named Jennifer, whose stepmother killed her father for his military pension, and another man named David, whose brother murdered their elderly parents for their estate. These connections had helped both Emma and I understand that while our specific situation was unusual, the fundamental challenge of surviving family betrayal was something that many people faced.
The hardest part, Jennifer had told us during one of the Foundation's support group meetings, isn't losing the parent who died. It's losing the parent who committed the crime. Because you have to grieve someone who's still alive, but is no longer the person you thought you knew. 3 months ago, Emma and I had received a letter from Mom in federal prison. It was the first communication we'd had from her since the trial ended, and opening it had required both of us to be together for emotional support. The letter was shorter than we'd expected, written in Mom's familiar handwriting, but containing words that felt foreign and inadequate. Marcus and Emma, I know you will probably never forgive me for what I did to your father and to both of you. I think about Robert every day, and I realize now that I destroyed the most important thing in my life for money that never made me happy. I don't expect you to visit me or write back, but I wanted you to know that seeing you both testify in court made me understand the kind of people your father raised you to be. You are better than I ever was, and Robert would be proud of the adults you've become. I'm sorry for everything. Linda. Emma had cried while reading the letter, not from sadness, but from a sense of closure she hadn't expected to feel. She finally admitted what she did, Emma had said. It doesn't fix anything, but at least she's not pretending anymore. I'd felt differently about the letter. While I appreciated that Mom had finally acknowledged her crimes, her apology felt too little and too late. The woman who had murdered our father and tried to steal our futures didn't get to seek forgiveness just because she was facing the consequences of her actions. But Dr. Santos had helped me understand that my anger was healthy and appropriate, and that I didn't owe forgiveness to someone who had caused such devastating harm to my family. Emma's more forgiving response was equally valid. We each had to process our trauma in our own way. The anniversary of Dad's death had become an important tradition for Emma and I. Every April 13th, we visited his grave together, brought flowers, and spent the afternoon sharing memories of him and updating him on our lives. This year, we'd brought copies of our college diplomas. Emma had just finished law school, and I had completed my CPA certification, photos of our new businesses, and a letter of gratitude from a family that Emma's foundation had helped win their own insurance fraud case. Dad, we did it, Emma had said, sitting beside his headstone. We got justice for you. We recovered the money you saved for us, and we're using everything you taught us to help other families avoid what happened to us.
Standing in my office now, 2 years later, I realized that Dad's greatest gift to us hadn't been the life insurance money or even the evidence that had helped convict his killers. His greatest gift had been the example he set of courage, integrity, and selfless love for his children. He'd shown us that doing the right thing was always worth the cost, that family loyalty meant protecting each other from harm rather than covering up crimes, and that love was measured not by what people said, but by what they were willing to sacrifice for those they cared about. Emma and I had both found ways to honor that example in our new careers and our commitment to helping other families seek justice when they faced similar betrayals. We'd learned that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, that trust must be earned rather than assumed, and that real family is defined by love and mutual support rather than genetics. But most importantly, we'd learned that even in the darkest circumstances, courage and integrity could triumph over greed and evil. Dad would have been proud.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.